if you haven't been with us for the last few weeks, we're going, in this part of the service, we're going through the book of Exodus. So it's the second book in the Old Testament. We're going to be looking at the second half of Exodus 12. There should be a few Bibles sitting around on chairs and things. It's on page, we're going to start on page 54. In verse 29 of Exodus chapter 12. It's going to seem a bit weird if you're coming in the middle of this. We've gone through kind of 12 and a bit chapters that if you've seen the Prince of Egypt, you'll recognize bits of the story. You've got the bad guy Egyptians who are holding God's people captive. You've got the baby who was born and then hidden in the river and was rescued at the last minute. You've got God who speaks out of a burning bush. You've got Moses who comes back to Egypt and who tells Pharaoh it's time to let God's people go. And we're into kind of one of the big turning points in the story in Exodus. So this is a really kind of crucial part of the history of God's people. It is something that is referred back to all the way through the rest of the Bible. It is a true story. It's something that really happened, but it is a real turning point in the Bible story that we're looking at today. The way that stories are told in the Old Testament feels a little bit different to what we're used to. We don't tell stories quite the same way, and so we need to kind of get our ear in a little bit. If you've ever been to see Shakespeare at the Globe, you may have had this experience where for the first 5 minutes, you don't really know what's going on because they're speaking in a slightly odd kind of version of English that you don't recognize. And then gradually you get your ear in. And even though you don't understand every word, you can tell what's going on in Merchant of Venice or Romeo and Juliet. It's quite similar when we read a story in the Old Testament. The way stories are told is a little bit different. I'm going to make a book recommendation just before we get into it that I find quite useful. So Dale Ralph Davis is kind of the epitome of how to understand the way that stories are told in the Old Testament. This book, The Word Became Fresh, is quite a useful way of getting into how to understand what God's saying in the Old Testament. So when we see stories told in the Old Testament, narrative, they're told in a particular way. There's things to look out for that are kind of keys and clues to unlock what's going on. So if you want to see that yourself, this is quite a good book to get into. It's quite short. He's quite funny, tells lots of stories. It's quite easy to read. The Word Became Fresh by Dale Ralph Davis. So I'm actually going to initially read the end of Exodus chapter 3, because I think that's important context to what we're going to see tonight. I'm going to read the end of Exodus 3, and then we're going to go, in fact, the end of Exodus 2, and then the end of Exodus 3. Then I'm going to read our passage, Exodus 12. Then I'm going to pray, then we'll dig in. So at the end of Exodus 2, this is what's happened. This is the kind of previously on. So, you know, in the kind of, if you're watching a serialized show, you get the previously on, you get kind of 5 clips that tell you almost exactly what's going to be important for what comes ahead. So Exodus chapter 2 and verse 23, during those days, many days, the king of Egypt died. The people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Towards the end of chapter 3 of Exodus, verse 21, God says this to Moses. This is God saying, this is what's going to happen. When you go back to Egypt, there's a whole host of things that are going to happen. There's going to be lots of plagues. There's going to be lots of kind of miracles and things going on. And then verse 21, he says, and I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty. So he's talking about what's going to happen when God's people escape slavery. But each woman shall ask of her neighbor, and any woman who lives in her house, for silver and gold and jewelry, and for clothing. You shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians. So let's flick forward to page 54. This is the bit that we're actually focusing on today. It's just useful to get the kind of context in the story. This will feel quite awkward, and we'll dig into it in a moment. Verse 29 on page 54, chapter 12. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where not someone was not dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, "Up, go out from among my people, both of you and the people of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you've said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We shall all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders. The people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing, and the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. A mixed multitude also went with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. And they baked unleavened bread of unleavened cakes of the dough that they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching kept to the Lord by all the people of Israel throughout their generations. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it, but every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised him. No foreigner or hired worker may eat of it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house. You shall not break any of the bones. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. If a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then he may come near and keep it. He shall be as a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you." All the people of Israel did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. And on that very day, the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. This is God's word. Let's pray. Our loving Father God, we thank you for your word, though sometimes it is difficult. We recognize that it is you speaking to your people. Father, as we think about your word, help us to see more clearly Jesus, who is our rescuer, the one who guards your people. Father, help us to wrestle with the difficult things and to remember that you are the good and loving God, that you do not change, that you are the same through all eternity. In Jesus' name, amen. At the back, I mentioned this earlier on, there is fact finders and sermon outlines. For those that find it kind of useful, the fact finders sometimes for younger people, it's useful to kind of see where we're going, to kind of track what's going to happen. I think there's space in the service sheets if people want to take notes as well. But if anyone needs fact finders, then Angela's got it. There, you can kind of grab one from her. There's pens and things as well at the back. Over the last few weeks, we've been stepping through the first few chapters of Exodus. We've been looking at Moses. We've been looking particularly in the last few weeks at the plagues. So it's quite kind of good cinematography. There's lots of kind of buzz and noise. There's lots of kind of back and forth between Pharaoh and Moses. Will he let God's people go or not? The different plagues are sent to kind of provoke Pharaoh to let God's people go, to let them go and worship God properly. It's been over 4 centuries since Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat had moved his family to Egypt. Over that 400 years, God's people had grown from this one family, from Joseph and his brothers, to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who the Egyptians had gradually turned into slaves. And in the last few chapters, we've seen God continuously say through Moses, it's time to let my people go. It's time to stop using them as slaves, to let them come and have the proper relationship with me that I promised them. It's time to let them go. And the last few weeks, the last few chapters that we've looked at, if you've seen the plagues in the past, if you've read this bit of Exodus, have been quite chaotic. So the sense, if you're making a movie of this section, is there's lots of noise. If you're doing some orchestration of an orchestra playing the piece of music that goes with the last few chapters, there's lots of chaos. There's lots of kind of pizzicato for the flies. There's lots of kind of out of tune oboes for the frogs. There's all of the kind of the noise and busyness going on all the way through the different plagues. There's lots of chaos happening. Pharaoh and Moses have been going back and forward. It seems like a power struggle, like a political battle. The day-to-day life in Egypt has had lots of disruption. As each of the plagues has come and gone, it's been a bit of a statement by God that various of the Egyptian gods have been undermined, shown to be not in charge. The water source in the Nile was affected. The food sources have been spoiled or destroyed. The outside world has made its way into their homes, into every nook and cranny of people's lives. Life's been turned upside down. What was certain for the Egyptians at one moment suddenly stops working. So no longer could they go to the Nile and get water out because it's been turned into something else. No longer were their crops safe because of the locusts. All of this noise and chaos has kind of disrupted normal life. The Egyptians' world has been turned upside down over the last few months. It's been chaotic. It's been noisy. It's been lots of movement and mess. Even when there was the plague of darkness, people were blundering around and bumping into things. There's chaos. But at this point in Exodus, the narrator cuts the lights, cuts the noise, cuts the buzz. I wasn't actually going to talk about this, but when I was doing A-level music, my kind of composition piece was about the plagues of Egypt. And I thought it was really clever. I thought it was kind of, as you do when you're 17. And I kind of all the way through built up this kind of layer upon layer of noise. And then when we got to this one, I cut everything. All the instruments stopped playing for a fairly uncomfortable 15 seconds. All the noise and the buzz and the chaos stops. The lights go down. The movement stops. It's quiet. It's dark. It's silent. It's the middle of the night. It's when you are at peace, when you're in your bed and it's quiet. Up until this point, God has warned Pharaoh what's going to happen if he keeps saying no, if he keeps refusing to let God's people go. And at one moment, at this point in time, God acts out what he's threatened Pharaoh with. Pharaoh's tried to prevent God's people leaving to go and worship him. He's tried to prevent, the way that God describes it throughout the first few chapters in Exodus, is that Israel, God's people, are God's firstborn, God's child. Pharaoh's tried to stop God's firstborn having a relationship with him. Pharaoh's flexed his muscles. He's showing God who is in charge. God's given him warnings about what's coming, and those warnings mean that Pharaoh is going to bear the responsibility for his rejection of God. God has made absolutely everything, so he's allowed to be in charge of absolutely everything. That's one of the messages that comes through Genesis and the first few chapters of Exodus. God made it, so he's in charge. He's chosen the Israelites as his special people. He's made them different from the rest of the world. He can demand when they come and go, where they worship him, and what he says needs to be obeyed. So Pharaoh isn't just engaging in large-scale politics when he defies what Moses tells him to do. He isn't even just doing something horrendous and heinous like slavery. So it is horrendous what he's done. He's turned almost 1 million people, probably more than 1 million people, into oppressed slaves. But that is not the worst part of what he's done. He set himself up as an alternative God to say, God is not the one in charge. The one who made everything is not in charge. I'm in charge. Now, when you and I do that in our day-to-day lives, and we do, we tend to do it in small-scale ways. So we tend to look at God and say, he doesn't get to decide what I think. He doesn't get to decide what I watch or what I wear, what language I'm allowed to use or not, how I talk about people or don't. It's kind of small scale. It matters. It's still as serious. But it is our circle of impact when we defy God, when we say, I'm in charge, not you, is much smaller than Pharaoh's here. When Pharaoh does it, he's doing it on a grand scale. He's telling the whole world he is the king of the world. I am more powerful. I'm bigger than God who made everything. Right down to the level of deciding when 1 million people can come and go, where they can live and what they can do. Since the first encounter, Moses has warned Pharaoh that there's a road where all this leads. Rebelling like this against God, probably the biggest rebellion against God in all of history, will lead to certain judgment. That's what he's been told by Moses. It will be Pharaoh's fault. You know what you're doing. You know what choice you're making. You have been warned. The writer of the book of Exodus wants us to know how sudden the judgment is and how comprehensive it is. You can see the pattern in several of the verses. The writer is not just saying this is a bad thing that happens. It's really comprehensive. All at once, a whole nation wakes up. From the palace to the prison to the field. Everybody, all at once. And everyone all at once sees a horrible truth. So in verse 29, we see the word all again and again. And then we see this phrase from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat in his throne to the firstborn of the captive in the dungeon and all the firstborn of the livestock, from the palace to the prison to the field. And then in verse 30, Pharaoh, this kind of cry starts in the throne room, in the royal bedrooms, and ripples out from Pharaoh to the servants' quarters, to the rest of the palace. It's like a camera that's kind of zooming out, and all across Egypt you see the candles coming on in the rooms, and then this plaintive cry go up. It's as if the previous plagues have all at once come back again. The ribbit that was everywhere from the frogs, the buzz of the flies and the zip of the gnats in every room, the sawing of the locusts that were thick as clouds. But this time, everywhere, no escape, it's plaintive human cries. Cries that are not saying, make it go away. They're saying, make this not be true. It's a really unpleasant scene. It affects everyone, everywhere, who doesn't follow God. It's meant to make us squirm. It's meant to feel uncomfortable. It's not something that we cheer. This is not something that we are happy about. The writer wants us to know that this affects everywhere. It affects all of geography, all of social class, everybody. Pharaoh's rebellion against God hasn't been the first shot of two equally matched warring powers. Previously, one of Pharaoh's predecessors had tried to eradicate the children of God's people. In the first couple of chapters, we saw that. And he still didn't manage to do what he threatened. Even Moses himself is proof of that. He was the baby that escaped that attempt. Pharaoh's people have seen that God did all of this, not like their previous Pharaoh tried to do, but all of it in a single moment. He entirely kept this promise of judgment. God is not Pharaoh. That's what the writer's telling us. These are not equally matched powers. God is not the same as Pharaoh. Pharaoh's threats are powerful for a moment, but he has no long-lasting control. God controls the world he's made, the people he's created, the Israelites he's chosen. This final plague is truly tragic. It is uncomfortable. We don't like seeing judgment on this scale. We're squirming inside. If you're anything like me, you will be, because if any human did this, it would be petulant. It would be wrong, because no human gets to decide whether other humans live or die and can do that fairly, justly. But the writer's telling us that's not true of God. God made everything. He's perfect. He's good. He's merciful. and his judgment is without fault. Ours wouldn't be, but his is. What's happening here is the perfect, the loving, the merciful, gentle, righteous judgment of God. We squirm because we can't wrap our heads around how death like this could ever be deserved. But the good and merciful God knows every possible outcome. He made everything, so is in charge. That's the context of the whole of the Bible. It is okay to squirm at these verses, but it's not okay for us to question whether it means that God's no longer good and perfect. These verses are in the context of the whole Bible that tells us that God is good and not capricious. That God is not like you and me. That what he's doing, he does as the God who is love. So in John's letters in the New Testament, he writes about God is love. And God doesn't change. There's not one God in the Old Testament and a different one in the New Testament. God doesn't become something that he wasn't all the way through. The God that we see working here is the one that John says God is love. We learn what true justice looks like, what true moral rightness looks like by looking at God at work, which is a mystery that we can't solve. It's difficult for us to get our heads around, and we will never understand it. But at this moment, Pharaoh understands that what he and his country suffer, they're suffering because he has defied God who chose Israel to be his firstborn. So, as he has done before, Moses and Aaron are summoned by Pharaoh. He tells them to come to the throne room, and he tells them it's time for you to be gone. In verse 31, he says he wants them out. He wants every last vestige of the Israelites out of Pharaoh's kingdom. None of them left behind, not even one. And on the way out the door, he does his kind of Columbo thing to Moses and Aaron and says, just one more thing. He commands Moses and Aaron to bless him, which seems like a strange request at this moment. But he's recognizing that the God who's commanded Moses and Aaron is the one that's in charge. He's asking for good in the place of evil, good in the place of suffering. He's asking for blessing instead of judgment, for mercy, where right now he's only got judgment. Pharaoh understands that he's suffering not an act of war, but an act of judgment. He's suffering what he and his country have deserved for how they treated God and how they treated his people. What he needs at this moment is God's mercy, not God's judgment. And that's what he's asking for in verse 32. Bless me also. Pharaoh's sentiment is replicated out across the country, just as the judgment affected from palace to prison to field. The desire is there across the whole country to get the Israelites out. In verse 33, we see the Egyptians were urgent. And the kind of casual observer would say, not surprised. They desperately want these people out. They're propelling them out of the door. They know that keeping Israel as slaves is what's led them to this point, and so they propel them on their way. In the pit of the night, the Egyptians pile precious goods into the Israelites' hands, and so the slaves leave with the wealth of the Egyptians in their pockets. The writer wants us to see this crazy contrast between the Israelites, who followed God's command to the letter and are so ready to leave that they can't even bake bread properly because all their baking equipment's already wrapped up in their traveling cloaks. But the Egyptians see the bags packed and the traveling clothes are on, and they're so keen to make sure they do actually leave that they pile jewelry and precious metals into the pockets of their former slaves. All this is fulfilling the promise that we read in verse 22 of chapter 3. Not only is God keeping his promise to judge those who oppose him, but he's keeping this specific promise to give good to his people, to give the Israelites blessings at the hand of those who oppress them against rational expectations. And so the Israelites leave and the Exodus begins. That's what the book's named after, the leaving of slavery and into the promised land. God's people leave behind slavery. They instead get wealth that they didn't earn, blessings that they couldn't accomplish themselves at God's hand. People who tried to replace God, to rub him out of history, to oppress his people, who lied and manipulated, they're getting judgment that they can't avoid. The rescue isn't complete yet, but the decisive action has happened. It's a statement about who's able to deliver on a promise. God's people have called out to him. We read that in verse at the end of chapter 2. God's people call out to him, and he hears them, and he's now rescued them all in a moment. Pharaoh's people in these verses call out to him, and all he can do is say, Moses, please, can you leave? Can you get out now? Can you give me good in the place of what I'm suffering? It's a statement about the future, what lies ahead. Those who believe God can be ignored, believe that he's irrelevant or powerless, have no long-term hope. They have nothing to hope for. But God's children, they're certainly free. They have hope that it's certain forever. From a human point of view, the journey that starts in these verses still has 40 years to go. They take the first steps out of the door. They're going to Succoth and then to the sea, to cross the sea on dry land that we'll see in a few weeks, to the mountain where they'll worship God, to the promised land that he's offered them. God's been at work for 4 centuries building to this moment. But one night at midnight, all at once, God's people are rescued. They're seen to rely on God and to be right to do that because he's helped them avoid the danger of ignoring him. They've heard the promise and the warning, and they've put their lives in the hands of the God who made everything. The final rescue is sure for them, though there's moments ahead that will make it look shaky. The final rescue is sure because God keeps his promise both to judge his enemies and to show mercy and blessing to his people. The decisive act is done. The sacrifice has worked. God's people are free for sure. We'll come back in a moment to verse 42. Verse 42 is kind of at the heart of everything that goes on in these verses. But at this point, this is one of the ways that kind of storytelling is a bit different in the way that kind of Old Testament stories are told. I say that. Rue and Gus and I were watching the latest episode of one of the Marvel series last night, and they're very firmly telling the story out of time. So the kind of Agatha series that's being released each week at the moment, the latest episode of it, none of it is told in a sort of time sequence. We get used to things happening with a beginning, middle, and end. The last episode was totally out of order with kind of flashbacks and flash forwards, which is massively confusing, and my wife hates it. But it's an interesting way of telling a story, and that's kind of what's happening here. When we get to verse 43, there's a bit of a flashback. It's telling us a bit more detail about what was happening at the point in time where all of the Egyptians were sleeping. It's a flashback to the day before, reiterating the details of what the Egyptians were doing when what the Israelites were doing when the Egyptians went off to bed. The big thing that the writer's telling us from verse 43 through to the end is that the Passover meal that they ate was a dividing line. God treated you differently depending on whether you ate the meal or didn't. You were treated differently if you were one of his covenant people than if you weren't. The meal is about insiders and outsiders, about who's in and who's not. You can get the blessing of God's protection, the writer's telling us, but only if you're on the inside. You can get the judgment that comes for rejecting the King of the universe if you are outside. The Passover meal was a meal that was designed for insiders, not outsiders. It's what God tells Moses and Aaron, verse 43, 45, 48, 49. The Passover meal is not about sustenance. It's not about giving them the nutrients they need. It's about who you belong to. It's a meal that you can eat, and it does you no benefit if you're an outsider. But you can't be an insider and not eat this meal. Eating it doesn't make you an insider, but not eating it or eating it in the wrong way makes you an outsider. What the writer's saying isn't a racial or an ethnic thing. He's not saying that that you can only eat this meal and be an insider if you were born in a particular place or you've grown up a particular way. There's ways for people who were born somewhere else to become an insider. But you can't come to the meal on your own terms. That's what the writer says. You can cook the food perfectly. It can taste the same as your neighbours, and it still might not do you any good. You have to come to the meal on God's terms. It's only to be eaten once you've done the basic requirements of belonging to God's people. Once you show that you align with Yahweh and not with Pharaoh. Once you've done that, you have to be gathered in the right way. You have to eat it with your family. You have to cook it in the right way. You have to distribute it the right way in your house. You have to do it on God's terms. Neither Israelites or outsiders get to bring their preferences to how this meal is eaten. There's no Passover meal that starts with, well, God is a loving God, and so he'll like the fact that I'm eating this at all. I can choose the way to eat this meal that's going to make me happy. God gets to specify how they gather, how they cook, how they distribute the food, how the whole thing works. God gets to decide the terms that they come to him on. It's actually quite a simple meal in a lot of ways. Follow these guidelines, and you're treated as an insider. I tell you how to be saved. Follow it, and you're saved. You get mercy and not judgment. There's a place for the Egyptians if they want to come and be part of this. They can follow the instructions too and be insiders and not outsiders. But they need to be willing to put themselves under God's authority, even if that puts them against Pharaoh. The whole passage is about two groups. Those who side with Pharaoh against God, and those who align with God, who made everything. God's allowed to be in charge of their lives, their patterns, their homes, their bodies. They've died to Pharaoh. They live under God's rule. And so they have hope of life and not fear of death. And we're told in verse 50, in an echo of verse 28 that we heard last week, that God's people do it. They do all of it. This time there's an emphasis on how the meal marks the line between inside and outside. It's not just the ritual of the meal that's important, but that God is the one who decides how people come to him. You need to be covenant people to benefit from the meal, and you need to live under God's kingship to benefit from the meal. But if you do, what a benefit. You have hope and not judgment. And that brings us back to verse 42 and what we talked about with the kids earlier on. On the one side, we have people who stand against God. All at once, they see the judgment of God that he's held back until this moment. And on the other, we see the dividing line, the meal that's eaten the right way by the people that God chose, faithful people trusting God. And in the middle, we have God who watches. It's verse 42. It was the night of watching by the Lord. That's the word that the writer uses. We might use the word guard. I think watch in our heads is quite a passive thing. A goalkeeper who watches as the ball goes in the goal is not doing their job. The goalkeeper's job is to guard their goal, to stop the ball getting in. A guard does two things. He defends what's precious, and he attacks what is threatening the precious thing. And on this night, God is playing both parts. He guards, he watches. He's guarding in both senses. We're told why. We're told the meaning of what he's doing. In one sense, that moment at midnight is just one point on a timeline. It goes back to Joseph and his brothers 400 years ago. It stretches forward to 40 years in the future when the Israelites finally get where they're going. But in the way that we're told this story, this moment is the defining moment for the people of God. As the Israelites eat the dividing line meal and as the Egyptians sleep, God is the one who's doing the work. He's the one who's doing it all at once in a single moment. He's not watching passively, he's guarding. It's a night of escape, but it's not a night of opportunistic escape like a kind of a prison break movie. It's a night of escape because the guard of heaven is doing the work to rescue his people, as he's promised right from the start. His people have cried out, and God has guarded them. That's all they could do. They could only cry out and depend on him, and he's guarded them. His people were helpless. They were under the control of the world's most powerful ruler. They were hungry in a land that was filled with food. They were slaves in a land that was rich. But God stood guard. When his people remember the Passover, they remember that fact that God stood watch. God guarded. He not only rescued his people like a prison break movie, he's even used the Egyptians, the captors, the enemies of God, to make it possible as they pile the jewelry into their pockets. God uses wicked people to speed the rescue of his covenant-loved children. It's not a comfortable story, because if we were to do this, we would be in the wrong, but God is right. And the crux of it is that it is God who is doing the guarding, who watches, who rescues, who judges enemies and rescues his undeserving, helpless people. We sometimes feel uncomfortable because the people in the narrative seem to be maybe more innocent than others. We know, at least if you've been in church for any length of time, that none of us are really innocent, but in practice we believe that some of us are a bit more innocent than others. We can just about stomach people dying because generally the world is corrupted by sin. It's sad and it's tragic, but God promises a better eternity to come. But to see a case like this, though it's rare, for God punishing anyone as a direct correlation for their sin, that feels awkward. Even more so when it's the children in this case who are bearing the punishment. In practice, we feel like a bystander is paying the price, but there's a couple of big Bible principles at play here. First of all, God throughout the whole of the Bible deals with families and not just with individuals. We think individually, but all the way through the Bible, God thinks in families. What parents do has an impact on their whole families, particularly what fathers do has an impact on what their wives and kids receive. There's a general truth there that what parents do, and particularly what fathers do, has an impact. It's generally true in the world that God set up. Pharaoh defies God, and so not just him, but his whole family gets judgments. In the homes of the Israelites, it's not that everybody individually cooks their own meal and then sits in their own little bubble. When the head of the house decides what's going to happen, he decides that the whole house is going to have this meal together. It's going to do it the way that God's commanded. And so the whole family, the whole household get mercy. One of the reasons that this grits on us is that we're trained to think atomically and not in terms of families. The other big Bible truth that's going on here is that it's designed by God to make us feel the horror and the wonder of what happens in the end when Jesus comes. What we see happening here is horrible, but if we feel the death of the firstborn of a rebel against God is uncomfortable, how should we feel about God himself sending his firstborn? God himself sending his only son. Neither firstborn nor lamb die, but the Son of God dies instead. We should be feeling the horror of it, but the scale of what God is doing. I'll come back to that in a moment. Just as we finish, there's three implications that I want to kind of touch on. This is a true story. It's important that we know it's true, but it also has implications for us right now in this moment. I've got three that I want to touch on just as we finish, that I think come out of this true story. First of all, we need to come to God or we're in real danger. Come to God or we're in real danger. In this final plague, we see an unusual case. Normally, what we see is God acting out his patience with rebellious sinners. Psalmists often talk about how God is slow to anger, full of unfailing love. And that is true. It's still true in these verses. But it doesn't mean that God ignores when people stand against him. He doesn't ignore when people oppress his own people. Living against God, putting ourselves as in charge of the universe instead of him, deciding what's right and wrong rather than letting God do it, that is dangerous. The writer wants us to know that. It might not always seem like it in our day-to-day lives, but we shouldn't take God's patience with us as ignorance of how we live or of lack of interest. All at once on this midnight, God intervened in Egypt. He'd warned Pharaoh it was coming, but Pharaoh not only stood against God, he didn't only oppress God's people, he led other people to do the same. The leaders bear a heavy weight of responsibility when they lead others to oppose God. In our safe London homes, our comfortable lives, yet still we're in real danger. Paul tells the Romans in the New Testament, the wages of sin are death. Every sinner deserves what happened that night, uncomfortable though that is. It is not a capricious and petulant God lashing out. It is God who's patiently warned Pharaoh and Egypt what will happen when we continue to oppose the God who commands worship. The warning hardened Pharaoh's heart, and so God kept his promise of judgment. And his judgment, this plague, is our warning. The warning's not to be like Pharaoh, whether on a big scale or a small scale, because with rebellion, with sin, comes judgment. It might not come overnight, and normally it doesn't, but it does come in the end. God's judgment is as inevitable for us as it was for the Egyptians. It's as comprehensive for us as it was for the Egyptians. From the palace to the prison to the field, for us, it's probably not going to look the same. But we have no hope of eternity, no hope that survives contact with the real world, just the same as those people who woke up and cried. Rebels get judgments. That is the big truth here. And we're all rebels. So this true story is here to warn us, turn away from trying to replace God, or our eternity is the same as Pharaoh's. And then second, it's a reminder here to come to God in his terms. The theme of the second half of the passage is that the meal was for insiders, but even the insiders had to eat it in the way God specified. They didn't get to determine who could and couldn't eat it, what the table stakes were. You had to have the mark of the covenant. When it talks about circumcision in the Old Testament, it was the mark of belonging to God's people. We see it in the New Testament with baptism. You had to cook the food in a particular way. You had to serve it in the right way, give it out in the right way. Obeying God's terms is what made the meal acceptable. We tend to negotiate our terms when we come to God. What makes it okay for us to eat the Lord's Supper? What makes me a good Christian? I get to decide. What makes someone good enough in church and what makes them an outsider? But God gets to decide. It's why when we eat the Lord's Supper together, we always have a moment where we say, here's why you shouldn't eat it if you've got this going on in your lives. It's welcome for everyone, but if you're still rejecting God, it's a dangerous thing to eat it. We don't have the privileges to draw the lines at different places for worshipping God than he does in his word. It really matters that the Israelites followed all the instructions, not just the general principles. But when they did, they got rescue, they got joy, they got abundance of blessing that was beyond what they could ever have dreamed of. In place of the threat of death, they got absolute certainty of rescue. And that's the promise that God extends to his people now too. We come to God in his terms, not on our performance, not on our goodness, but staking our eternity on Jesus' obedience, not because I'm well behaved. And we get the same blessing that was promised to them too. Rescue that is certain, that lasts forever. Then finally, the last implication is this, that what's true of God in the Old Testament remains true in the New Testament. It remains true now. God doesn't change, he doesn't evolve. God stands guard over his people. God stands guard over his people, over you, if you stake your eternity on Jesus. So what God's people remembered when they had the Passover meal in the years to come, when they kept the meal once a year, they were remembering that God stands guard. He attacks the enemy of God's people. He defends the life that is precious to him. God watches, God guards. For you and I, it's what we remember when we remember Easter. That is our Passover. It is the one moment in history planned from before the dawn of the world. The one moment when God guarded his people all at once, defeated the enemy, released his people from slavery. God stands guard. In that case, God stands guard by giving his own son to die in place of his people. You and I, if we trust in Jesus, we're rebels who deserve the same fate as the Egyptians. But instead, we get the Israelites rescued. We get mercy because God stands guard. God himself is the one who dies in our place. When we sing about that, when we remember Easter, when we have the Lord's Supper, when we baptize a new baby or a new Christian, that's what we remember, that God watches, God guards, God is the hero. When we had no defense against the coming judgment, God guards us from the judgment that comes from being sinners. We're guarded forever, for certain. It's a big implication. I want to finish just by reading two things. Firstly, I want to read a few words from Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So I think it sums up some of what we remember when we remember the God who guards. So if you know the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there's been a battle with the White Witch. The White Witch is going to put to death Edmund as a traitor. Edmund thinks he's in danger, but Aslan, the great lion, stands in place. He says, I'll die instead of Edmund. So this great hope for Narnia, who was going to break the power of the witch, says, "I'll die instead of Edmund." And so the White Witch thinks she's won. She puts the lion to death. And then the two sisters, Susan and Lucy, they stand, they kind of untie Aslan, try and give him some dignity, thinking he's died, and they cry, watching him. And then Aslan comes back to life. And he's explaining to Susan and Lucy what's happened to them. And I think this kind of captures, C.S. Lewis was trying to capture what we've been thinking about, the God who stands guard. And he tells the sisters this: the witch's knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked a little further back into the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read there a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treason was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack. Death itself would start working backwards. That is the promise, that when the willing God dies in the place of sinners, death itself begins to work backwards. I'm going to echo that with words from Romans chapter 5, and then we'll pray and sing again. This is what it means that God stands guard. Romans chapter 5 and verse 6. For while we were still weak, at the right time, Jesus died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since, therefore, we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. For while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son. Much more, now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life. That is what is true of you and I. We deserve the fate of the sinner, and yet we get offered the fate of the rescued slave. We're offered that promise that we were saved by the Son who died for us. Let's pray.